Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Enable Insight Data-Driven Risk Assessments with AI. My name's Simon Taylor, and I'm the Vice President of Global Partner Alliances at Lucidworks. Joining me today is George, as a partner at Soho Squared. Just like to give you a short background on both of us before we jump into the session today, so we can get the most out of the discussion. So George is a managing partner at Soho Squared, a consulting firm providing advisory services and delivering innovative solutions for information risk and insight. George has extensive experience with legal and compliance technologies and information analytics. He has a JD from DePaul College of Law and is admitted to the Illinois State Bar and the Federal District for Northern District of Illinois as well. Conversely, I lead all of Lucidworks search, discovery, and AI in direct channel business, which includes nearly every single partner that we have at Lucidworks. I've served in various different senior and exec level information risk, security, and compliance roles at several large multinational organizations now in IT, financial, and pharmaceuticals as well. I didn't do a legal degree. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science. So with that said, that's a bit of background on both of us. We're going to do a bit of a tag team very much through this session today. So I'll kick off a little bit, and then I'll pass to George shortly. Okay. So first things first, the topic today around data insight into risk is very much linked to the whole idea of data governance, sensitive data management, whether you're looking at the global landscape of GDPR or other types of sensitive data issues. This has been around with us for some time. I myself have been doing this for nearly 20 years, as George, pretty much the same. But what we're seeing now is that there's a significant challenge facing the majority of organizations in really getting true insight and understanding the level of risk posed by sensitive data, by different forms of data compliance, whether it's PHI or whether it's things that are more financially regulated, or just generally personally sensitive data. And Gartner, obviously, as an analyst, very much believe in this as well. And the compliance side of it, not just on the people and process side, just understanding where risk is very much where a lot of people are trying to focus right now. And that's part of what we want to talk to you about today. The bigger issue really is, where is the scope, or where is the really crux of this challenge? And it all comes down to three core areas, the way I see it. The first one is volume of data growth, and it's not just necessarily in typical unstructured content. It's all domains of data, whether it's human, machine, IoT, processed, transactional, creates a level of risk in terms of what type of data is being stored, what's the nature of that data, and it's a massive amount of data as well. We're not really talking the same things we were doing 20 years ago now. The scope of sensitive data just for things like data privacy, and I have a lot of background in data protection in the European Union, for example, and now GDPR. Very different scenario than we're faced with over 12, 13 years ago. So that's the number one area, which is the sheer volume and the scope of what's involved. The second big area is really around distribution. And this really is the multidimensional aspect of data risk, which isn't just about knowing what it is, why it's being stored, and how it's being classified, which is typically the governance approach. It's about things that we don't know about. How is data moved? What is the timeline of that data? How is it evolved? Contextually, two pieces of data separated, aren't so sensitive, bring them together, become more sensitive. Things like that really create much more of a broader context. And to that point, really, historically, sensitive data has been well defined. We know a contract in an organization has a legal implication. Therefore, we create and store that separately in some form of record-keeping system. We have a healthcare record for an individual as an employee record. We store that somewhere else. We have a governance requirement around compliance of email. So we have an SEC 17A compliance system to go and provide compliance and oversight in that area, and so on. But now, because the combination of data creates different types of sensitivity, and then when you move that in and out of jurisdiction or even globally into more sensitive environments, the context changes constantly, and it's very manual in orientation. So what this lends itself to is a much more insightful view of how to manage risk, which is sort of what George is going to talk about in a second. The other thing really is, as we look at the global landscape, there are a few things that really really focus the attention in people's mind. And I think GDPR is just a good idea. And now with some of the changes in the California privacy law as well, just focus people's minds on more around insight. So I think when GDPR first came along as an update to data protection principles in Europe, it was very much along the lines of, oh, great, this is a new organizational process. It's more about people and putting in place governance and oversight, particularly in things like right to destroy, right to forget, and also the nature of discovery or disclosure in relation to sensitive data requests. But what it really did as well, is to highlight how the transient movement of data affects people's view of risk. For example, what happens when I move data between member states? What happens when I move it into the US? What happens when I'm a US organization dealing and supporting an organization that's in Europe and I'm maintaining and managing some of that data in relation to those entities? And how does that change how I view risk and insight specifically? So what really the view of this from my perspective is that GDPR and initial implementations were great at sorting out people and process, but that didn't necessarily give you a determination of where is my data and where is my risk. It gave you a determination of really where to go look, because you know where you commonly manage things, but it didn't give you a true nature of what risk was being created through the movement and timeline of data, which we're going to pretty much get into in this conversation. So to that point, let me hand over to George, and he can give you a little bit more insight from his perspective on what risk through insight really means.
Great, thanks, Simon. So if you think about this, the modern technologies that we really have today speed the aggregation, they speed the movement and the access to information. And it's really through that aggregation of information and the ability for us to analyze and aggregate large sets of information that allows us to drive insight, which is needed, right? The businesses that we run today are much more flexible, they're dynamic, we move much more rapidly. And in order to do that, we have to be able to analyze, aggregate, and move a lot of information. Well, that same capability also then creates a level of risk. And traditionally, if you looked at the risk side of the equation and the analysis and the insight side of the equation, those were two different things. Risk platforms were run in a security or as part of a compliance function. Insight and analysis, of course, was driven either from a business or potentially a technology function. The solutions were different. The practices were different. How they looked at information was often different. And what we're trying to actually get to is realize that it's fundamentally the same thing, which is understanding what that information is, being able to drive insight into what information is that allows us to effectively assess and then manage risk. So the information, the way we look at it is information really defines the risk. And if you look at the regulatory frameworks that exist today, either in statute or in standards or in various regulatory forms, there's actually quite a bit of fragmentation, and that's global, and it's here in the U.S. as well. You know, from a global perspective, the broadest type of regulation that we really do have is GDPR, and it's probably the only thing that tries to provide a pan geography view of and set of standards around how do you deal with sensitive information. But again, the practice is really, or the regulation is really formed around the nature of the information and how information allows your security or your privacy at an individual level to be at risk. And it doesn't look at systems, it doesn't really look at controls. It talks about those as a means to protect fundamentally and address how information is used or processed. In the U.S., we have a slightly different regulatory framework. We have both federal and state level. The state levels at this point vary a fair amount. The federal levels are really focused generally on industry, and there isn't a broad federal program yet. The closest that we're starting to see would be something along the lines of the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, modeled somewhat on the GDPR, a little bit different. But what you're going to start to see probably is movement, and there has been at a national level to try and harmonize the different state frameworks. At this point, it's still in discussion, and given the nature of where we are politically in the U.S., unlikely to necessarily change immediately, but there is a drive to harmonize that. But the core really, again, gets to the information itself. It's really the information that defines the risk. And so what is it that we're able to do to assess or monitor or understand how that information or the nature of the information that we have is being used in a given place? There's different frameworks that are out there. This is NIST Framework from a risk management perspective, right? And so what NIST tries to do is say, look, we're going to categorize a set of systems. And based on the category we are able to, of those systems, we're able to then assess a level of risk and assign a set of controls associated with those risks. That's fine at some level, but really what it also gets down to is, if you go back and look at what the regulations are really trying to deal with and what security and privacy and compliance really means today, it again all goes back to the information. And the controls that we have today are often focused on system-level controls, access controls. Who had access to that system? Are we monitoring whether or not somebody had attempted to access that system through log files, through access control logs, and things like that? But what tends not to happen is actually anything that assesses whether or not the information in that system is actually conforming to what's supposed to be there. And if you look at a lot of the breaches that have occurred, or you look at a lot of the risk that's out there, it's not necessarily that someone has pilfered information through some, hacking through some firewall. Of course, those happen, and security is deployed in layers. But it's also often that people have access to a set of information because it didn't belong in a particular place, or they had access to it and they misused it. And so if you're not actually monitoring and then assessing how information is actually being used or being stored or being processed, it doesn't really matter if somebody has access or not. That person might have access, but they've exceeded the authority and they've exceeded the controls that they have. And so proactively applying a level of risk management and being able to ascertain and assess whether or not information is where it's supposed to be, if it's not where it's supposed to be, whether or not a set of information in one geography ended up in a different geography where it's fine as long as it's in geography 1, it's not if it ends up in jurisdiction 2. And those are the things that you have to start to monitor. And then this framework, as you see, talks about both assessing your controls and monitoring them proactively over time. So there's lots of different ways to think about how to manage and assess risk. And so we try to abstract this a little bit from any particular tool or technology, but rather think about all of the different capabilities that are necessary to really manage risk or assess risk. And the capabilities are really driven and focused in a few areas, but they're really driven by the volume, the velocity, and the complexity of data. And the volume, velocity, and complexity of data is then overlaid with the fact that the infrastructures that we manage today or businesses today are highly dynamic. The idea that everything exists within the four corners of a network or exists within a books and records system is largely irrelevant today. We know that that's not the case. Even mid-size and small companies leverage cloud technologies. They leverage SaaS platforms. They leverage different collaboration systems. They have third-party suppliers manage different parts of their infrastructure. All of those things create a level of risk, and all of those things also create a level of highly dynamic infrastructure. And so if we're going to be able to then analyze a set of information in a data environment, understand what that data is actually doing, and then assess whether or not it's creating a risk for us, we have to have a bunch of these different capabilities. And these capabilities are driven around things like the ability to have an open platform that allows us to adopt and assess new types of information very rapidly, connect to different systems, whether they're internal or external, and then more importantly, start to leverage the capabilities that come along with things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, because the volume and the complexity of data is such that traditional methods are just going to be very difficult to use over time. The idea that we're going to start to build fixed taxonomies and have people file their data into certain locations and make sure it's protected only based on somebody's eyes or people's practices, we know that doesn't work, and that's been proven time and time again. And so being able to adopt things like content-driven classification and clustering is an important part of the equation as well. So with that, I'm actually going to turn this back over to Simon.
Thanks very much, George. So what we're going to do, and this is the fun part of the whole webinar, is now get into a little bit more around specifically some ask the audience type questioning. So very quickly, I'm going to be shortly putting you on a polling here just to ask you a very simple question, which is really to do with what you've done in relation to sensitive data risk. Because George and I both know that there's a very good best practice around this today, but there's a certain reality to it as well, which is we've all come from backgrounds around certain types of thought, procedural process around governance that really sort of have dictated for some time how we should approach this. And we also know that some of that doesn't work either. So to that point, the question I'm going to ask is very much around the adoption. And I'm going to break that down into sort of 5 areas. And please feel free to respond as you need to. Whether you've thought about data curation, in other words, have you taken a very traditional approach on type and location of content, tried to classify risk that way. Whether you've looked at it more from a forensic or auditability perspective, that might be more e-discovery or compliance assessment related. Whether you've tried to approach it from a minimization point of view, which is, hey, we need to rationalize some of the content that's in my file system, and as a result, try and consolidate it a little bit, and that's how you've approached it. Whether you've tried to wholesale erase content because you were worried about the risk it was creating and therefore wanted to remove it both from production and also backup and archive systems as well. And then finally, whether you really thought about it from secure data transfer, which is a bit unusual, but more and more companies are starting to see, okay, well, let's look at what data has moved around the organization. So to that point, let me move it over to a poll, and I'll ask you to put your questions, your answers in, please. We'll give it a few minutes for people to respond. Okay, let's see what the results are. Hopefully we've got a good corpus of people involved here. So let's move to the next slide and we can see some analysis, and hopefully it's going to pop up. Or maybe we have a few problems here. Okay. Well, I could certainly get the research to you or the results after we've done the session today, but for those of you who did respond, appreciate that. And we'll hopefully get the results to you shortly. I'm not quite sure why these haven't popped up today. Anyway, so assuming that there was a reasonably even distribution coming from this, which is often the case, there then comes the question of really, how do we take some of the ideas that George was mentioning earlier and move them into a sort of a reality of what's available today, and how do I get to this more of this capability approach to risk insight. Now, from that point of view, there is a lot of technology out today that's more insight related. And one example is search technology. That's some of the LucidWorks background that we have today on this call. But really, I really wanted to talk about more in terms of where this is going and really what an effective platform looks like in this area, because I think it would help to shape some of the context that George has laid up front. So today, you could approach this from a search technology. You could implement a simple search across your organization, and that would give you a certain amount of valuable information that relates to maybe some areas of types of data, things that are more related to that context. But that's really not going to be the core crux of what you're after here. The second area is what we call enriched search, which is where we start to introduce things like classification, clustering technology, where we start to relate conurbations of data, where we start to maybe auto-curate or auto-classify and group data much more holistically, primarily because we want to navigate into it much more specifically, which is an enriched model of insight. Where we really see true value from some of the things George was talking about, like machine learning, is when we get into really more of the anomaly detection, looking for things and relationships of information and dimensions that really aren't that apparent on simple and enriched search, which is sort of where we need to go today to get much more of the understanding around risk insight versus the traditional models that we have in place. And the ultimate goal is to really build that into a 360 view, which has a multi-user perspective, so that we can look at maybe somebody that's responsible for compliance, somebody that's responsible for GDPR, somebody that's responsible for HR and personnel risk and all be accessing and looking a corpus of insight across an organization, but from different perspectives, depending on their particular focuses. And really, that's what we mean by about a platform, a piece of technology that really starts to join the dots in some of these areas that are extremely challenging. Now, if we take this idea and we move it a little step further, and we relate this to, where do we want to come from and where do we want to go to? What I tried to show you here is a little bit about the challenges we face, what we're looking for, and how these pieces of technology that George was alluding to link together. And the idea today is to be very much more of an informative session, but obviously there's underpinning technology and framework that we can talk about in future sessions that underline this. So sensitive data, as I mentioned earlier, isn't just about the usual suspects. It's system generated, it's human generated, application, database content. It's all of the above, particularly if you look at different types of vertical solution areas like finance, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, different contexts, different types of systems. And then on the flip side, the solution we need, which is a lot more proactive insight, looking for patterns and relationships of information that we haven't really maybe focused on historically. So how do the technologies fit? Well, the first thing is we shouldn't need to move and manage large amounts of data again just to get to a point where we can get insight. So technologies in this area is what you should maybe be familiar with, which is data warehousing or big data technologies. They tend to move large quantities of data. What we're talking about here is inverted indexing technologies, content indexing, getting visibility into insight sources, but then moving that into a model where we can look at it and do something with it. So we're protecting the security, we're protecting the context, but we're understanding how, when that data is brought together, what sort of risk or insights being created. Then we use clustering and topics to give some basic definition to that at time of ingestion. So really what we're looking at is if this particular entity relates to this particular entity and they're the same thing, then let's cluster and group things logically as it makes sense, and more of an auto-curation or auto-taxonomy model. Then we've got defined rules. Well, a defined rule would be if I find these three things, including social security number and credit card, it must be by definition something that's a financially sensitive piece of data under PHI, some sort of financial legislation. Where we get into more interesting areas is natural language, where we actually want to ask questions. So tell me about the nature of my risk associated with healthcare. And that question is then interpreted into much more real-time query building dynamic models that allow us to surface insight from information, but in a way that we necessarily haven't thought about, which is also then where machine learning comes in, which is math, basically. What we're doing is we're applying an algorithm against the corpus of data to say, if I ask you or ask to look for this type of curated or non-curated, that's deep machine learning, models around information, what would you deliver back and how would that data relationships be represented? And if so, can I start tagging and clustering data based on that? Think about e-discovery, predictive coding, things like that a few years ago, and how that was a very curated model around what we define as risk in relation to maybe custodian data and how that feeds to predictive models. What if we didn't have that? What if we didn't know what predictive models look like and we were asking or training a machine learning model to go off and discover that? And that's where the dimension aspect of data, things like movement, regressive time analysis, things like that really help. And then there's the other aspect of it, which is very much human-based around interpretation. How do we learn from people that are actually looking at this as analysts on a daily basis and build intellectual models that tune and understand the relevancy of data, with the ultimate goal of making the correlation and relevancy as specific and as accurate as possible when we want to determine what risk is. And to do that, we use something called clickstream or user signals, which is where we're monitoring and utilizing what people have ranked, rated, how they've clicked, navigated through information, use clusters to help, use classifications, tags, metaphors, and so on, to basically improve the result set that they get every time they perform a search or an insightful view of analytics. And these how these things relate to each other. And really, if you go back to the slide which George talked about in terms of the capabilities framework, and then fast forward to this, you've really got both sides of the pendulum, the need, and then you've really got the platform in terms of how these capabilities connect. And the goal is to really deliver something with a platform that can really solve these challenges and link them together. Now, to that point, let me show you, everybody likes to see what does an effective tool look like. So, as an example, here's something that relates to all the different aspects we were talking about. This is an investigative portal around risk analysis and insight built for a particular customer, variety of different data in this area. But here, what are we showing? We're showing geospatial data. We're linking the distribution of risk to where that's occurring by IP lookup, by geo lookup, things that relate to where the person's related to the content that is the nature of risk, and correlating that into something that people can visually see. In the upper right, I've got a timeline element, which I'm talking about what happened and where the risk areas have occurred over particular periods of time, and how does that relate down here to my particular classifications or types of information. There's other things in here that relate to particular individuals and how that relates to groups or classifications of risk, and in this case it's more crime related actually. But this is what effective insights tools start to look like, and of course each one of these is different based on your needs, but having the right type of platform that links these technologies together and can deliver that in a much faster time to value model is really what people are looking at today. So with that, let me just flick back to George again, and George can sort of summarize a little bit before we finish up the session today.
Great. Right. Well, so one of the things we're trying to make sure that everybody understands out of this is that this approach adds another layer of, so security, as I mentioned before, is really a multi-layered program. And so you'll see different layers of controls and processes in place. This is a layer that we think and find tends to be missing, again, the focus on the information itself. And it's an important part of any risk management program because it's focused on the data and the inherent risk as opposed to system-level controls, which we believe, as we noted, are somewhat incomplete. It also allows us to be much more proactive in analyzing and assessing over time, which is a key part of any risk management practice. It's not a matter of setting the controls up once and then walking away. It's making sure that and monitoring that you're actually doing these things out over time. And finally, it actually accepts and understands that we're working in a highly dynamic environment in most cases, and business and technology is moving very rapidly. We have to be able to adapt appropriately. So with that, I think we're wrapped. Simon, I think you wanted to...
Yeah, sure. Let me finish off. So thanks very much, George. Very much appreciate that insight. A couple of things I really wanted to get into. We actually have the results, I think, showing now. So I'm going to jump and show those results from that poll we had a little bit earlier. So we'll do that in a second. So let's just bring that up a minute. But before we do that, just wanted to give a quick plug, really. So we've been talking a little bit about, obviously, some of the technology that LucidWorks has in this area to go and support these insights, and obviously working with partners like Soho Squared, really important to us. But if you want to hear more about this, specifically in relation to how this can help drive much more risk insightful solutions, please come along to Activate. You can find a lot of information at activateconference.com. It's our major conference for people to learn about this type of thing. Now, with that said, just before we jump into questions, let's just jump to the polls here, and hopefully you can see the results. So right now, it appears that securing data transfers has been the top issue, but also I think data minimization and then an even spread across the rest of them, with erasure being one of those areas that maybe people haven't addressed. That's pretty atypical of a US view. If we were going to run this in Europe, probably data erasure would be much more sensitive and be much more rocketing to the right. But just give you some insight that most of these areas are equally as important, but as I suspect a lot of the time, and George suspects, it's actually data transfer, the movement of data and how that moves over time, that is really creating a level of risk that people have no idea how to really gain insight around today. Now, with that said, let's jump on quickly to questions and see if anybody has asked some short questions here. So I'm just looking at the Q&A specifically. Not seeing anything right now. Oh, there's two here. Janessa, I think you have one that you wanted to, that someone's highlighted as well, right? No, maybe not then.
Sorry, I do have one. So someone asked here, their company already has a proactive approach. So how do they augment this into their overall strategy? Hey,
George, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, not
completely sure what part of the proactive approach has already been deployed, but I guess I would ask if the proactive nature of your controls, again, are at a system level as opposed to a data level, and whether or not it's focused on things like access controls and access logging, or whether or not you're actually assessing and monitoring whether or not specific types of data are in certain places where they're supposed to be or where they're not supposed to be, whether they're moving across geographies, and things like that. So that's, I guess, where I would add a proactive component based on what we've described.
And Janessa, are there any other questions as well?
Yes, we have another question here that says, this all sounds great, but how do I actually start?
Hey, George, I think that's another one for you, unfortunately.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Well, I think the first thing is, start with an area that, well, two things. One, understand the nature of the risk that you do have, and then realize where you're focused right now in areas that don't allow you to see the actual data and the underlying data that could create risk. And pick one or two of those areas and then look at deploying a solution like this to start to look at that information. I think a lot of people always start with grand plans to try and connect every single data source, analyze every single piece of data right out of the gate, and it becomes a very big and challenging and complex problem. And I think if you focus on one or two areas that you know create potential risk, and whether that be geography or whether that be certain types of information or sensitive areas of work, that's usually the best place to start.
That's great. Thanks very much, George. Well, in the spirit of time here, thanks very much for everyone joining. Really appreciate it. Thank you, George, for your contribution, and Janessa for organising. And obviously, please feel free to reach out to us at LucidWorks and Soho Squared if you have any questions or other types of thought process. Thanks very much.